Marcus Thompson had carried the weight of judgment for 15 years. Every sideways glance, every whispered comment, every job interview that ended abruptly when they saw his forearm. It all traced back to one tattoo that most people dismissed as meaningless scribbles. What they didn't know was that those seemingly random marks held a story of brotherhood forged in the fires of combat, a promise made in blood, and a sacrifice that saved 12 lives in the mountains of Afghanistan. Sometimes the most profound truths are hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone who understands their language to reveal their power. Marcus Thompson stood at the edge of the construction site, his hard hat slightly crooked as sweat dripped down his face in the scorching Arizona sun. The concrete mixer churned nearby, drowning out most conversations, but he could still hear the familiar snickers from the crew working behind him. It was always the same, the pointing, the whispered jokes, the way conversations stopped when he rolled up his sleeves. The tattoo on his left forearm had been the source of mockery for 15 years now. To most people, it looked like a child's drawing, jagged lines, random symbols, and what appeared to be poorly executed tribal markings. His co-workers at Henderson Construction had nicknamed him Kindergarten because of it, and the name stuck like cement to his boots. "Hey, Kindergarten!" shouted Danny, a heavy-set man with arms like tree trunks, as he approached with a clipboard. "Boss wants to see you in the trailer. Probably going to ask about that masterpiece on your arm again." Danny chuckled and shook his head. "I swear, man, whoever did that tattoo must have been drunk or blind. Maybe both." Marcus said nothing. He never did. He learned years ago that explanations only made things worse. People saw what they wanted to see, and what they saw was a construction worker with bad taste in body art. They didn't see the nights he woke up screaming, the way his hands shook when helicopters flew overhead, or the pills he'd stopped taking because they made him feel like he was drowning in thick syrup. The trailer sat at the edge of the site like a metal island in a sea of dirt and machinery. Marcus knocked twice and entered when he heard Bill Morrison's gruff voice telling him to come in. Morrison was a good boss, fair, honest, and willing to hire guys who other companies wouldn't touch. He'd given Marcus a chance when nobody else would. And for that, Marcus was grateful. "Sit down, Thompson," Morrison said, not looking up from the blueprints spread across his desk. "We got a problem." Marcus settled into the plastic chair across from the desk, his boots leaving small clumps of dried mud on the trailer floor. He waited, knowing that Morrison would get to the point in his own time. "Johnson from the city planning office came by this morning." Morrison continued, finally, raising his eyes to meet Marcus's gaze. "They're bringing in some military consultants for the new VA hospital project. Big contract, Thompson. The kind that could set this company up for the next 5 years." Marcus nodded slowly. He could sense the but coming from a mile away. But these military guys, they're particular about image. Professional appearance, clean records, the whole 9 yards. And, frankly, Marcus, that tattoo of yours. Morrison gestured vaguely toward Marcus's forearm. "It doesn't exactly scream professional competence. More like, well, like something you'd see on a guy who can't make good decisions." The words hit Marcus like a sledgehammer to the chest, but he kept his face neutral. He'd heard worse. Much worse. "I'm moving you to the night shift for the duration of this project," Morrison said. "It's not personal, Thompson. You're one of the best workers I've got. But business is business, and I can't afford to lose this contract because some consultant thinks we employ people who look unprofessional." Marcus stood up slowly, his joints protesting after a long day of physical labor. "I understand, Mr. Morrison. Night shift starts tomorrow. Tonight, actually, Rodriguez called in sick, and we're behind schedule." Morrison's expression softened slightly. "Look, Marcus, I know this isn't fair, but sometimes life isn't fair. You of all people should understand that." The comment stung more than Morrison probably intended. Marcus nodded and headed for the door, his hand automatically moving to cover the tattoo that had just cost him daylight hours and normal human interaction once again. As he walked back toward his truck, Marcus caught sight of his reflection in the trailer's window. 38 years old, graying at the temples, with lines around his eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights and too many memories he couldn't shake. The tattoo on his forearm was partially visible beneath his rolled-up sleeve, the black ink stark against his weathered skin. He remembered the day he'd gotten it, 12 years ago in a dingy parlor in Phoenix. The artist had looked at him like he was crazy when Marcus showed him the design, a seemingly random collection of symbols and marks that he'd drawn on a piece of notebook paper. The guy had shrugged and done the work, taking Marcus's money without asking questions. That was one of the things Marcus liked about tattoo artists. They minded their own business. The drive home to his small apartment took him through the part of town where most of the veterans lived. Subsidized housing, check-cashing stores, and bars that opened at noon and stayed open until the last drunk stumbled out. Marcus had lived in worse places, but this neighborhood had a familiarity that felt almost comfortable. Nobody here judged anybody else too harshly. They all had their own demons to wrestle with. His apartment was on the second floor of a building that had seen better decades. The stairs creaked under his weight as he climbed to his door, keys jingling softly in the desert evening. Inside, the air was stale and warm despite the window unit air conditioner that ran constantly during the summer months. Marcus dropped his work boots by the door and padded to the kitchen in his socks. The refrigerator hummed and rattled, containing the usual collection of leftovers, energy drinks, and a six-pack of beer that he tried to make last the entire week. He grabbed a bottle of water instead and settled into his recliner, the only piece of furniture in the living room besides a small television and a coffee table covered with unopened mail. The silence in the apartment was profound. No voices from neighboring units, no traffic noise from the street below, just the steady hum of the air conditioner and the occasional creak of the building settling. Marcus had grown to appreciate the quiet, even though it sometimes amplified the thoughts he tried to keep buried. He looked down at his forearm, studying the tattoo that had shaped so much of his civilian life. The design was approximately 4 inches long and 2 inches wide, consisting of what appeared to be random geometric shapes connected by thin lines. To most observers, it looked like a poorly executed attempt at abstract art, or perhaps some kind of gang marking that didn't quite fit any known patterns. But Marcus knew better. Every line, every symbol, every seemingly random mark told a story that only a handful of people in the world would understand. It was a map, a memorial, and a promise all rolled into one. It was the last thing his squad leader had drawn in the dirt before bleeding out in Marcus's arms on a mountainside in Afghanistan. Staff Sergeant James "Jimmy" Rodriguez had been more than a squad leader to the 12 men under his command. He'd been a father figure, a voice of reason, and the glue that held their unit together during 3 tours of duty in some of the most dangerous terrain in the world. Jimmy had a wife named Maria and twin daughters who sent care packages filled with homemade cookies and crayon drawings of soldiers with big smiles. The day Jimmy died, their convoy had been ambushed while returning from a routine patrol. The explosion from an improvised explosive device had flipped their Humvee and trapped Jimmy beneath twisted metal and shattered glass. While Marcus and the others worked frantically to free him, Jimmy had used his finger to draw symbols in the sandy soil beside the wreckage. "Remember this," Jimmy had whispered, his voice growing weaker with each word. "Promise me you'll remember." Marcus had memorized every mark, every line, every detail of what Jimmy had drawn. He'd thought it was delirium, the confused ramblings of a man losing too much blood too quickly. But as Jimmy's breathing grew shallow, he'd grabbed Marcus's arm with surprising strength. "It's not what you think," Jimmy had said. "It means something. It means everything." Those were Jimmy's last coherent words. He died before the medevac helicopter arrived, before the medics could extract him from the wreckage, before Marcus could ask him what the symbols meant. The official report listed Staff Sergeant Rodriguez as killed in action by an enemy improvised explosive device. It didn't mention the drawings in the dirt or the promise a young soldier had made to remember something he didn't understand. Marcus had carried that image in his mind for 2 years before finally deciding to have it permanently etched into his skin. He tried to forget it, tried to move on, tried to convince himself that it had been nothing more than the random scratchings of a dying man. But the image haunted him, appearing in dreams and quiet moments when his guard was down. The tattoo artist in Phoenix had done a decent job of reproducing the design, though he'd cleaned up some of the lines and made the overall image more symmetrical than it had been in the original dirt drawing. Marcus had paid extra to make sure the proportions were exact, even though he still had no idea what any of it meant. For 12 years, the tattoo had been nothing but a source of embarrassment and judgment. Employers saw it as unprofessional. Dates saw it as a sign of poor decision-making. Fellow veterans occasionally asked about it, but none had ever recognized the symbols or understood their significance. Marcus had begun to wonder if Jimmy's final moments had indeed been nothing more than confused delirium. Maybe there was no hidden meaning, no secret message, no profound truth waiting to be discovered. Maybe it was just the random scratchings of a dying man, and Marcus had spent over a decade carrying around a meaningless collection of lines and shapes. The thought depressed him more than he cared to admit. Jimmy had been the best man Marcus had ever known, brave, intelligent, compassionate, and absolutely devoted to the soldiers under his command. If Jimmy's last act had been meaningless, then what did that say about the meaning of his life? What did it say about the meaning of any of their lives? Marcus finished his water and stood up, stretching muscles that ached from the day's work. Night shift meant he had a few hours to kill before heading back to the construction site. He could try to nap, but sleep rarely came easily during daylight hours. He could watch television, but most daytime programming consisted of talk shows and soap operas that held no interest for him. Instead, he decided to take a walk. The neighborhood wasn't particularly scenic, but movement helped clear his head and sometimes tired him enough to sleep for a few hours before work. He grabbed his keys and wallet, slipped his feet back into his work boots, and headed for the door. The evening air was still warm, but the oppressive heat of the day had begun to fade. A few children played in the courtyard between apartment buildings, their voices echoing off concrete walls as they chased each other around a small playground that had seen better years. An elderly woman sat on her balcony, watching the kids play while she sipped from a large glass filled with ice and what looked like sweet tea. Marcus walked toward the main street, nodding to neighbors he recognized but rarely spoke to. There was Mrs. Patterson, who worked nights at the hospital and was probably getting ready for her shift. There was Tom, a Vietnam vet who spent most of his time sitting on his front step, watching the world go by with eyes that had seen too much. As Marcus reached the corner, he noticed a small crowd gathered around something in the parking lot of the convenience store. Not a fight or an accident, just people standing in a loose circle, looking at something with expressions of curiosity and mild concern. Marcus approached slowly, his natural instinct being to avoid crowds and potential trouble. But as he got closer, he could see what had captured everyone's attention. A man in military dress uniform was sitting on the curb, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking slightly. The uniform was pristine, navy dress blues with multiple ribbons and insignia that spoke of years of service and combat experience. But the man wearing it looked broken, defeated, like someone who had reached the end of his rope and didn't know which way to turn. Somebody should call someone, a woman was saying. Police, ambulance, somebody. He's not hurt, another voice replied. Just upset about something. Maybe drunk. Military guys, they got their own problems, added a third person. Best to leave them alone. Marcus found himself stepping closer, drawn by something he couldn't quite identify. Maybe it was recognition. The familiar sight of a fellow service member struggling with demons that civilians couldn't understand. Maybe it was curiosity about what could reduce a decorated sailor to tears on a street corner. As he got within a few feet of the crowd, the man in uniform raised his head, and Marcus caught sight of his face. Even streaked with tears and twisted with grief, it was clear that this was someone accustomed to command, someone whose presence normally demanded respect and attention. Sir, Marcus said quietly, his voice barely audible above the murmur of the crowd. You okay? The man looked up, his eyes focusing on Marcus with some difficulty. He appeared to be in his 50s, with graying hair and the weathered complexion of someone who had spent years in harsh climates. His uniform bore the insignia of a Navy commander, and his ribbon rack told the story of multiple deployments and commendations. The commander started to speak, then stopped, shaking his head. Just lost someone important. Someone I should have saved. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He knew that feeling intimately, the guilt the self-blame, the endless replaying of moments when different decisions might have led to different outcomes. Without thinking, Marcus knelt down next to the commander, ignoring the curious stares from the crowd around them. "Combat?" he asked quietly. The commander nodded, fresh tears streaming down his face. "Afghanistan. 3 weeks ago. Should have been me. Should have been me instead of him." Marcus understood. The survivor's guilt never fully went away, never stopped gnawing at the edges of consciousness during quiet moments. It was a weight that grew heavier over time, not lighter, because every day of life felt like another day stolen from someone who deserved it more. "What was his name?" Marcus asked. "Peterson," the commander replied. "Lieutenant Commander Jack Peterson. Best sailor I ever served with. Left behind a wife and 2 kids. His voice broke on the last words. Marcus nodded slowly, his hand instinctively moving to cover the tattoo on his forearm. He thought about Jimmy Rodriguez, about Maria, and the twin daughters who would grow up without their father, about all the names carved into black granite in Washington, D.C. "I'm sorry for your loss," Marcus said simply. "I know it doesn't help, but I'm sorry." The commander looked at Marcus more closely, taking in his work clothes, his calloused hands, his general appearance. "You serve Army. 3 tours in Afghanistan." Something shifted in the commander's expression, recognition, perhaps, or simply the acknowledgement that he was speaking to someone who understood the weight he was carrying. "What unit?" the commander asked. 10th Mountain Division. "You." "SEALs." The commander wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, trying to compose himself. 28 years active duty. Thought I'd seen everything. Thought I was prepared for anything. But losing Peterson, he shook his head. Some things you're never prepared for. Marcus understood completely. No amount of training, no amount of experience, no amount of mental preparation could fully insulate someone from the impact of losing people they cared about. The military taught soldiers how to fight, how to survive, how to complete missions under extreme conditions. But it didn't teach them how to live with the ghosts of the people they couldn't save. "You got family?" Marcus asked. The commander nodded. "Wife. 2 kids, both grown. They're why I'm here, actually. My daughter lives about 10 minutes from here. Drove down from San Diego to visit, to try to—" He gestured vaguely. "To try to make sense of things, I guess." Marcus could see that the crowd was beginning to disperse, the initial curiosity giving way to the realization that this was a private moment of grief rather than public entertainment. A few people continued to watch from a distance, but most had returned to their own business. "You want to get a cup of coffee or something?" Marcus asked. "I know a place that's quiet." The commander looked surprised by the offer, but after a moment of consideration, he nodded. "That would be good. Thank you." They walked slowly down the street, neither man speaking, both lost in their own thoughts. The commander had composed himself somewhat, straightening his uniform and wiping away the last traces of tears, but Marcus could see the pain still etched in his face. The diner Marcus had in mind was a small, family-owned place that stayed open 24 hours to cater to the various shift workers in the neighborhood. It wasn't fancy, vinyl booths, fluorescent lighting, and a menu that hadn't changed in decades, but the coffee was strong and the staff minded their own business. They settled into a corner booth, and Marcus ordered coffee for both of them. The commander stared out the window at the darkening sky, his hands clasped tightly on the table in front of him. "You ever wonder if it's worth it?" the commander asked suddenly. "All of it. The service, the sacrifice, the people we lose. You ever wonder if any of it actually matters?" Marcus considered the question carefully. It was something he'd wrestled with for years, especially during the dark periods when the nightmares were worst and the future seemed most uncertain. Some days, Marcus admitted, some days it feels like it was all for nothing. Like we just threw away years of our lives and watched good people die for no reason at all. And other days? Marcus thought about Jimmy Rodriguez, about the 12 men in their squad who had made it home because of Jimmy's leadership and sacrifice. He thought about the villages they'd helped protect, the schools they'd helped build, the children who were alive today because soldiers like Jimmy had been willing to put themselves in harm's way. Other days I remember that there are people alive today because of what we did. Families that are still together, kids who got to grow up, communities that are safer. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all we can ask for. The commander nodded slowly, seeming to consider Marcus's words. Peterson died, saving his entire unit. Threw himself on a grenade to protect 8 other sailors. 8 men who are going home to their families because Jack won't be going home to his. Then, his death had meaning, Marcus said firmly. His sacrifice saved 8 families from going through what his family is going through now. That doesn't make it hurt less, but it means something. I keep thinking I should have seen it coming, should have done something differently. I was his commanding officer. His safety was my responsibility. Marcus recognized the familiar refrain of survivor's guilt, the endless cycle of what if and if only that could consume a person if they weren't careful. You can't save everyone, Marcus said quietly. Trust me, I've tried. I've replayed every mission, every firefight, every moment when someone under my watch got hurt. You could drive yourself crazy thinking about all the things you could have done differently. But the truth is, sometimes good people die despite our best efforts. Sometimes that's just the price of being human in a dangerous world. They sat in silence for several minutes, both men lost in their own memories and regrets. The coffee arrived, and they sipped it slowly, neither in any hurry to break the comfortable quiet that had settled between them. Finally, the commander spoke again. What's your name? Marcus Thompson. Robert Shun. The commander extended his hand, and Marcus shook it firmly. Thank you for this, Marcus. I needed to talk to someone who understands. Anytime, sir. Just Robert. I'm off duty. Marcus smiled slightly. Okay, Robert. You gonna be all right? Robert Shun considered the question seriously before answering. Eventually. It's gonna take time, but eventually. What about you? You doing okay with whatever you're carrying around? Marcus automatically glanced down at his forearm, where the tattoo was hidden beneath his long sleeves. Some days are better than others. But I keep going. That's all any of us can do, Robert said. Keep going and try to make it mean something. They finished their coffee in companionable silence, 2 veterans sharing the kind of understanding that didn't require many words. When they finally left the diner, the sun had completely set, and Marcus needed to head home to prepare for his night shift. I should probably get going, Marcus said as they stood outside the restaurant. Got to work tonight. Construction, right? Robert had noticed Marcus's work clothes and the calluses on his hands. Yeah, nothing glamorous, but it pays the bills. Robert nodded, understanding that many veterans ended up in jobs that were far removed from their military specialties. The transition to civilian life was rarely smooth, and good jobs for former soldiers were often hard to come by. It was good talking to you, Marcus. I mean that. Likewise. You take care of yourself, Robert. They shook hands again and walked in opposite directions, each man returning to his own life and his own struggles. Marcus didn't expect to see Robert Shun again. Their paths had crossed briefly during a moment of crisis, and now they would diverge again. But as Marcus drove back to his apartment, he found himself thinking about their conversation and the pain he'd seen in Robert's eyes. It reminded him that everyone was fighting battles that others couldn't see, carrying weights that weren't always visible from the outside. Back in his apartment, Marcus prepared for his night shift with the mechanical efficiency of long practice. Clean clothes, work boots, thermos of coffee, and a sandwich for his dinner break. The routine was comforting in its predictability, even if the work itself had become monotonous. As he was getting ready to leave, Marcus caught sight of himself in the bathroom mirror. The fluorescent light was harsh and unflattering, highlighting every line on his face and making him look older than his 38 years. But what drew his attention was his forearm, where the edge of his tattoo was visible beneath his rolled-up sleeve. For the first time in years, Marcus found himself wondering if there really was more to Jimmy's final drawing than he'd been able to discover. Maybe he'd given up too easily. Maybe he hadn't looked hard enough. Maybe the answer was out there waiting to be found. The thought stayed with him as he drove to the construction site, as he checked in with the night supervisor, as he began another shift of moving concrete and steel under the harsh glare of floodlights. Somewhere out there, maybe someone knew what Jimmy Rodriguez had been trying to tell him in those final moments. Maybe it was time to find out. The night stretched ahead of Marcus, full of familiar rhythms and predictable tasks. But for the first time in months, he felt something that might have been hope stirring in his chest. It was a small flame, easily extinguished, but it was there. And sometimes Marcus thought as he lifted another load of rebar, sometimes a small flame was enough to light the way forward. The construction site at night was a different world from the daytime chaos of multiple crews and constant supervision. Under the bright work lights, everything took on a stark, almost theatrical quality. Shadows were deeper, sounds carried farther, and the work took on a meditative quality that Marcus had grown to appreciate. Tonight, he was working with a crew of 5 other men, all of whom had their own reasons for preferring the night shift. There was Carlos, who took care of his disabled mother during the day. There was Mike, who was working his way through community college and could only attend classes in the morning. There was David, whose wife worked days, and they needed to coordinate childcare. The night crew was different from the day shift in more ways than just scheduling. They were quieter, more focused, less inclined to waste time with small talk or pranks. They understood that they were there to work, to earn their paychecks, and to go home to whatever lives waited for them in the daylight hours. As Marcus moved through the familiar motions of his job, his mind kept drifting back to his conversation with Robert Chun. There had been something about the commander's grief that felt familiar, not just because Marcus understood loss, but because it reminded him of something specific. Something about the way Robert had talked about responsibility, about feeling like he should have been able to prevent what happened. It wasn't until Marcus was taking his dinner break around 2 in the morning that the connection became clear. He was sitting alone in the break trailer, eating his sandwich and thinking about Jimmy Rodriguez when the memory surfaced with startling clarity. Jimmy had said almost exactly the same thing the night before he died. They'd been sitting around a small fire, sharing stories, and trying to stay warm in the thin mountain air when Jimmy had started talking about his responsibility to the squad. "Sometimes I feel like I'm supposed to be able to see everything coming," Jimmy had said, his voice barely audible over the crackling flames. "Like I should be able to protect all of you from everything that might happen out here. And I know that's impossible, but I can't shake the feeling that if something happens to one of you, it'll be because I missed something because I wasn't smart enough or careful enough or good enough." Marcus had tried to reassure Jimmy at the time, telling him that he was the best squad leader any of them could ask for, that he couldn't control everything, that they all understood the risks. But Jimmy had shaken his head, unconvinced. "My dad was career Army," Jimmy had continued. "Served in Vietnam. Came home with stories he never wanted to tell. But he told me once that the hardest part wasn't the fighting or the fear or even the dying. The hardest part was coming home and trying to explain to people why it mattered, why the sacrifice was worth it." Jimmy had poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up into the dark sky. He said most people never understood, never really got it. But he said that every once in a while, you'd meet someone who did understand, someone who could see the bigger picture. And those moments made everything else bearable. At the time, Marcus had assumed Jimmy was talking about the war in general, about the broader mission they were all part of. But now, sitting in the break trailer 12 years later, Marcus wondered if Jimmy had been trying to tell him something more specific. Maybe the symbols Jimmy had drawn in the dirt weren't random at all. Maybe there was some kind of code, some kind of message that would only make sense to someone who understood the context. Maybe Jimmy had been trying to ensure that his sacrifice would be understood by someone, even if that understanding came years later. Marcus finished his sandwich and pulled out his phone, using the camera to take a picture of his tattoo. The image quality wasn't great under the fluorescent lights of the trailer, but he could make out the basic shapes and lines clearly enough. Looking at the photograph, Marcus tried to see the design with fresh eyes, to imagine what it might represent beyond the seemingly random collection of marks he'd been carrying around for 12 years. But without context, without some kind of key to decode the symbols, it still looked like abstract art at best. He was about to put his phone away when a text message arrived from an unknown number. Marcus almost deleted it without reading, assuming it was spam, but something made him open it instead. "Marcus, this is Robert Chun. Got your number from directory assistance. Hope you don't mind. Wanted to thank you again for tonight. Sometimes talking to someone who understands makes all the difference. If you're ever in San Diego, look me up. Would be happy to return the favor. Take care of yourself." Marcus stared at the message for several minutes, surprised by how much it meant to him. He'd helped Robert through a difficult moment, but he hadn't expected any follow-up contact. The fact that Robert had taken the time to track down his number and send a thank you message said something about the kind of man he was. Marcus typed a brief response. "Glad I could help. Take care of yourself, too." He hesitated for a moment, then added, "If you ever need to talk, don't hesitate to reach out." After sending the message, Marcus found himself thinking about connection, about the ways that people's lives intersected at crucial moments. His encounter with Robert had been random, unplanned, but it had meant something to both of them. It reminded Marcus that even in his isolated existence, he was still capable of making a difference in someone else's life. The remainder of his shift passed quickly, the physical labor providing a welcome distraction from the thoughts and memories that had been stirring in his mind. By the time the sun began to rise over the construction site, Marcus was tired enough that sleep might actually come easily. As he drove home through the early morning traffic, Marcus found himself taking a different route than usual, one that led past the small veterans cemetery on the outskirts of town. He'd been there a few times over the years, usually on Memorial Day or Veterans Day, to pay his respects to friends who hadn't made it home. On impulse, Marcus pulled into the cemetery parking lot and walked among the white headstones until he found the section dedicated to Afghanistan and Iraq veterans. The graves were newer than those in other sections, the grass still green and well-maintained, the flowers and small flags still bright and fresh. Marcus didn't know any of the names on these particular stones, but he felt a connection to them nonetheless. These were his brothers and sisters, people who had served in the same places he had served, who had faced the same dangers and made the same sacrifices. Standing among the graves in the soft morning light, Marcus felt the weight of all the stories that would never be told, all the dreams that would never be fulfilled, all the families that would never be whole again. But he also felt the weight of responsibility, the obligation to live a life that honored their sacrifice, to find meaning in his own survival. As he walked back to his truck, Marcus made a decision. He was going to find out what Jimmy Rodriguez's final drawing meant. He was going to research military symbols, talk to other veterans, reach out to anyone who might be able to help him decode the message that had been hidden in plain sight for 12 years. Maybe it would lead nowhere. Maybe Jimmy's final moments really had been nothing more than confused delirium. But Marcus owed it to Jimmy's memory to find out for sure. He owed it to himself to finally understand what he'd been carrying around all these years. The sun was fully up by the time Marcus reached his apartment, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded him of sunrises in Afghanistan. For the first time in months, he fell asleep easily, his mind focused on a purpose that felt bigger than just getting through another day. In his dreams, he was back on a mountainside with Jimmy, but this time he understood what the symbols meant. This time he was able to save his squad leader's life. This time his story had a different ending. But even in dreams, Marcus knew that some things couldn't be changed. The past was fixed, immutable, carved in stone like the names in the cemetery. What mattered now was what he did with the future, how he chose to honor the sacrifices that had brought him to this moment. Tomorrow, Marcus decided as he drifted deeper into sleep, tomorrow he would begin his search for answers. Tomorrow he would start trying to decode the message that Jimmy Rodriguez had literally died trying to give him. And maybe, if he was lucky, he would finally find someone who could help him understand what the hell that tattoo really meant. Marcus woke up at 3 in the afternoon with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The decision to finally investigate Jimmy's tattoo had crystallized during his sleep, and now he felt an urgency that surprised him. After 12 years of passive acceptance, he was ready to actively seek answers. His first stop was the public library, a modest building that served the surrounding neighborhoods with limited resources but dedicated staff. Marcus had never been much of a researcher, but he figured the internet access and reference materials might give him a starting point. The librarian, a middle-aged woman named Patricia, seemed genuinely pleased to help when Marcus explained that he was researching military symbols and codes. She directed him to several computers and helped him access databases that specialized in military history and insignia. For 3 hours, Marcus scrolled through thousands of images of military symbols, unit patches, rank insignia, and ceremonial markings from dozens of countries and time periods. He compared each design to the photograph of his tattoo, looking for any similarities or connections that might provide a clue. Nothing matched exactly, but Marcus began to notice certain patterns. Some of the lines in his tattoo resembled elements found in Special Forces unit patches. Other symbols bore a passing resemblance to markings used by various NATO allies. But without a direct match, Marcus couldn't be certain of anything. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus expanded his search to include symbols used by indigenous peoples, religious groups, and even criminal organizations. Jimmy Rodriguez had been from New Mexico, and his family had roots in both Hispanic and Native American communities. Maybe the symbols came from those traditions rather than military sources. But, again, Marcus found only tantalizing similarities rather than definitive answers. A curved line here, a geometric shape there, but nothing that screamed this is what it means with absolute certainty. Frustrated, but not defeated, Marcus decided to try a different approach. He copied the image of his tattoo and printed several copies, then began visiting local military recruiting offices and veterans organizations. If anyone would recognize military symbols, it would be people who had devoted their careers to military service. The Army recruiting office was his first stop. The staff sergeant on duty was polite, but unhelpful, admitting that the symbols didn't match anything in his knowledge base. He suggested Marcus try the VFW Hall, where older veterans might have broader experience with historical military markings. The VFW Hall was a low-slung building that had seen better decades, but it hummed with the quiet energy of men and women who had served their country in various capacities. Marcus felt more comfortable here than he had anywhere else in years. These were his people, even if they didn't know it yet. He showed his tattoo to a dozen different veterans, ranging from World War II survivors to recent returnees from Iraq and Afghanistan. Each person studied the image carefully, and several offered theories about what it might represent, but none could provide a definitive identification. A Korean War veteran named Frank thought the geometric patterns might be related to artillery targeting symbols. A Vietnam-era Marine named Jose suggested they could be special operations navigation markers. A Gulf War Army medic named Sarah wondered if they might be unit identification codes used by intelligence units. All interesting theories, but all ultimately speculative. Marcus thanked each person for their time and input, but left the VFW Hall with more questions than answers. His next stop was the local VA hospital, where he hoped to find veterans counselors or medical staff who might have encountered similar tattoos during their work with former service members. The hospital was a sprawling complex that served veterans from across the southwestern United States, and Marcus figured the staff there would have seen just about everything. Dr. Elizabeth Martinez, a psychiatrist who specialized in treating combat-related PTSD, was intrigued by Marcus's story and his tattoo. She examined the image carefully and asked detailed questions about the circumstances under which Marcus had received it. "I've seen thousands of military tattoos over the years," Dr. Martinez said, adjusting her reading glasses as she studied the photograph. "Most fall into predictable categories: unit insignia, memorial pieces, patriotic symbols. But this is definitely unique. The composition is very deliberate, very structured. It doesn't look random at all. So you think it means something specific?" Marcus asked. "Oh, I'm certain it means something specific. The question is what, and to whom?" Dr. Martinez leaned back in her chair, still holding the photograph. "Have you considered that it might not be a traditional military symbol? Maybe it's something more personal, more specific to your squad leader's experience or background." Marcus had considered that possibility, but he wasn't sure how to pursue it. Jimmy Rodriguez had never talked much about his life before the Army, and Marcus had lost touch with the other members of their squad after returning to civilian life. "Do you have contact information for any of the other soldiers who served with you and this Rodriguez fellow?" Dr. Martinez asked. Marcus shook his head. "I tried to stay in touch with a few guys right after we got back, but people scatter, you know? They move on with their lives, try to put the war behind them. I couldn't blame them for that. Have you tried social media? Facebook, LinkedIn, Veteranos Reunião sites. A lot of former service members use those platforms to maintain connections with their old units." The suggestion surprised Marcus. He'd never been much for social media, viewing it as a waste of time and an invasion of privacy. But maybe Dr. Martinez was right. Maybe the internet could help him reconnect with people who had known Jimmy Rodriguez and might understand the significance of the symbols. Dr. Martinez gave Marcus several websites that specialized in connecting veterans with their former unit members. She also provided him with information about military record archives and suggested he contact the Army Personnel Command to see if they could provide contact information for his former squad mates. That evening, Marcus created his first social media profile in years, specifically focusing on veteran-oriented platforms. He posted the image of his tattoo, along with a brief explanation of its origin and his search for its meaning. He also reached out to several Facebook groups dedicated to 10th Mountain Division veterans. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, Marcus had received dozens of messages from fellow veterans offering theories, suggestions, and their own stories of mysterious military symbols. Most of the responses weren't helpful, but a few provided promising leads. A former Special Forces medic named Tony suggested that the symbols might be related to escape and evasion protocols used by special operations units. A Navy intelligence officer named Linda thought they could be communication codes used during joint operations with Allied forces. A Marine named Carlos wondered if they might be related to something called blood chits, documents carried by airmen containing messages in local languages. But the most intriguing response came from someone who claimed to have served with Jimmy Rodriguez before Marcus's deployment. A man named David Chun, no relation to Robert Chun, the Navy commander Marcus had met, said he had been in Jimmy's squad during an earlier tour and remembered Jimmy drawing similar symbols during briefings. Marcus immediately sent David a private message asking for more details. David responded within an hour, providing a phone number and suggesting they talk directly rather than trying to communicate through social media. The phone conversation with David Chun lasted nearly 2 hours and provided Marcus with more information about Jimmy Rodriguez than he'd ever known. David painted a picture of a squad leader who was not only tactically brilliant, but also deeply interested in the cultural and historical aspects of the regions where they served. Jimmy was always drawing maps and diagrams, David explained. Not just tactical stuff, but cultural symbols, local landmarks, historical references. He said understanding the land and the people was just as important as understanding the enemy. According to David, Jimmy had spent considerable time during his first deployment studying Afghan tribal symbols, Pakistani military markings, and even ancient trade route markers that dated back centuries. He had notebooks full of sketches and diagrams that he'd compiled from conversations with local interpreters, captured documents, and historical research. Did he ever mention anything about symbols that had special meaning to him personally? Marcus asked. David was quiet for a moment, apparently thinking. There was one thing, he said finally. Jimmy told me once that his grandfather had served in World War II as a code talker. Navajo, I think. Jimmy was proud of that connection. Said his family had a tradition of using symbols and codes to communicate important information. The revelation hit Marcus like a lightning bolt. If Jimmy's grandfather had been a code talker, then Jimmy might have inherited not just pride in that tradition, but actual knowledge of symbolic communication systems. The symbols he'd drawn in the dirt might not be random military markings at all. They might be a deliberate message encoded in a system that only someone with specific cultural knowledge could decipher. David, do you remember anything specific about those symbols Jimmy used to draw? Anything that looked like what I sent you? Somewhat looked familiar, yeah? But, Marcus, here's the thing. I don't think Jimmy expected most of us to understand what he was drawing. I think he was creating his own system, combining different traditions and knowledge bases into something unique. Something that would only make sense to someone who had all the pieces. After ending the call with David, Marcus spent the rest of the evening researching Navajo code talkers and the symbolic systems they had used during World War II. The complexity and sophistication of the code was amazing. The Navajo language had provided an unbreakable encryption system that had helped win the war in the Pacific. But as Marcus delved deeper into the research, he realized that understanding the code talker tradition was only the beginning. Jimmy had apparently created his own hybrid system, combining elements from multiple sources into something entirely new. Deciphering it would require not just knowledge of Navajo symbols, but also understanding of Jimmy's personal experiences, his military training, and his individual psychology. Marcus was beginning to understand that his search for answers might be far more complex than he'd initially imagined. But he was also more convinced than ever that Jimmy's final drawing had been deliberate and meaningful. This wasn't the confused scribbling of a dying man. It was a carefully crafted message that Jimmy had died trying to deliver. The next day, Marcus requested time off from work to travel to New Mexico. If Jimmy's family roots were connected to the Navajo code talker tradition, then someone in his hometown might be able to provide the cultural context Marcus needed to understand symbols. Bill Morrison wasn't thrilled about giving Marcus time off during a busy period, but he agreed to a long weekend after Marcus explained that it was related to a personal matter involving his military service. Morrison had learned over the years that it was best not to ask too many questions when his employees mentioned their time in the service. Marcus drove to New Mexico in his aging pickup truck, following highways that took him through landscapes that reminded him of Afghanistan: high desert, rocky hills, and endless sky. The similarity was both comforting and unsettling, bringing back memories of missions and friendships that felt like they belonged to a different lifetime. Jimmy's hometown was a small community nestled between mesas and arroyos, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, and family histories stretched back generations. Marcus had an address for Jimmy's mother from military records, though he wasn't sure if she still lived there or if she would be willing to speak with him. The house was a modest adobe structure surrounded by a well-maintained garden filled with native plants and vegetables. An elderly woman was working in the garden when Marcus pulled up, her movements deliberate and graceful despite her obvious age. "Mrs. Rodriguez?" Marcus called as he approached the gate. The woman looked up, shading her eyes with her hand as she studied Marcus. Her face was weathered by years of sun and wind, but her eyes were sharp and alert. "Depends who's asking," she replied, but her tone was more curious than hostile. "My name is Marcus Thompson. I served with your son Jimmy in Afghanistan. I was hoping I could speak with you about him." The change in Mrs. Rodriguez's expression was immediate and profound. The wariness disappeared, replaced by a mixture of grief and warmth that told Marcus everything he needed to know about how deeply Jimmy had been loved. "You knew my Jimmy?" she asked, setting down her gardening tools and approaching the gate. "Yes, ma'am. He was my squad leader. He saved my life more than once." Mrs. Rodriguez studied Marcus's face for a long moment, as if looking for some sign of her son in his features. Then she opened the gate and gestured toward the house. "Come in," she said. "I'll make coffee. You can tell me about my boy." The interior of the house was comfortable and lived in, filled with photographs, military memorabilia, and traditional crafts that spoke of a family deeply rooted in their cultural heritage. Marcus noticed several items that appear to be Navajo in origin, including a beautiful rug hanging on one wall and what looked like traditional silver jewelry displayed in a cabinet. Mrs. Rodriguez served coffee in hand-painted mugs and settled into a chair across from Marcus. She waited patiently while he gathered his thoughts, clearly accustomed to giving people time to process difficult emotions. "Jimmy was the best leader I ever served under," Marcus began. "He cared about his soldiers like they were family. He always put our safety ahead of his own, always made sure we had what we needed, always found a way to get us through dangerous situations." Mrs. Rodriguez nodded, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "That sounds like my Jimmy. Even as a little boy, he always looked out for others." Marcus spent the next hour sharing stories about Jimmy's leadership, his humor, his dedication to his men, and his tactical brilliance. He told Mrs. Rodriguez about missions they'd completed together, about times Jimmy had gotten them out of trouble, about the respect and affection the entire squad had felt for their leader. But he was careful not to mention the circumstances of Jimmy's death or the symbols he'd drawn. That conversation would require more trust and understanding than they'd built in an hour. Finally, Mrs. Rodriguez asked the question Marcus had been expecting. "How'd he die, Marcus?" "The Army told me it was an IED, but it didn't give me details. I need to know what happened to my son." Marcus took a deep breath and told her everything. The routine patrol, the the sudden explosion, the desperate effort to free Jimmy from the wreckage, the symbols drawn in the dirt, and Jimmy's final words about remembering something important. When he finished, the room was quiet except for the ticking of an old clock on the mantelpiece. Mrs. Rodriguez had listened without interruption, her face displaying the controlled grief of a mother who had already mourned her son, but still needed to understand every detail of his final moments. "You said he drew symbols in the dirt?" she asked finally. Marcus nodded and pulled out his phone, showed her the photograph of his tattoo. "I memorized what he drew and had it tattooed on my arm. I've been trying to understand what it means for 12 years. Mrs. Rodriguez took the phone and studied the image intently, her expression changing as she recognized elements of the design. She handed the phone back to Marcus and walked to a wooden chest in the corner of the room. From the chest, she retrieved a leather-bound journal and several sheets of paper covered with sketches and notes. She brought them back to the coffee table and spread them out where Marcus could see them. Jimmy's grandfather was indeed a code talker, she said, but he was also a medicine man and a keeper of traditional stories. He taught Jimmy about symbols and their meanings when Jimmy was young. The papers were covered with drawings that bore striking similarities to elements in Marcus's tattoo. Not exact matches, but clear family resemblances that suggested a common origin or influence. "But these symbols," Mrs. Rodriguez continued, pointing to Marcus's tattoo, "these are not traditional Navajo markings. These are something Jimmy created himself, using knowledge from many different sources." She opened the journal and flipped through pages of Jimmy's handwriting, stopping at a section that appeared to contain detailed notes about symbolic systems and communication codes. Jimmy believed that symbols could carry multiple layers of meaning, she explained. He studied not just traditional Navajo markings, but also military codes, astronomical symbols, even ancient trade route markers. He was trying to create a system that could communicate complex ideas to people who understood the references. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. This was exactly what David Sean had suggested, that Jimmy had been creating his own hybrid symbolic system. But what was the specific message he'd been trying to convey? Mrs. Rodriguez continued reading through Jimmy's journal, occasionally showing Marcus sketches and notes that related to the symbols in his tattoo. Gradually, a pattern began to emerge. The symbols weren't random or decorative. They formed a kind of map or diagram that showed relationships between different concepts and locations. "Here," Mrs. Rodriguez said, pointing to a page of notes. Jimmy wrote about something he called warriors' directions. Not just geographic directions, but spiritual and emotional guidance for soldiers who had lost their way. She showed Marcus a drawing that contained several elements from his tattoo, but arranged differently and accompanied by explanatory text in Jimmy's neat handwriting. He believed that soldiers needed more than just tactical training to survive combat. Mrs. Rodriguez continued. They needed spiritual anchoring, cultural grounding, and a sense of connection to something larger than themselves. Marcus studied the journal pages with growing amazement. Jimmy's notes revealed a sophisticated understanding of symbolic communication and a deep concern for the psychological welfare of the soldiers under his command. But more importantly, they provided the key to understanding the specific message Jimmy had died trying to deliver. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Marcus said carefully, "do you think Jimmy was trying to tell me something specific with those symbols? Something about how to navigate life after the war?" She looked at Marcus with eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "I think my son knew he might not make it home from that war," she said quietly. "And I think he wanted to leave something behind for the soldiers who did make it home. Something to help them find their way when they felt lost." She turned to a specific page in the journal, one that contained a detailed explanation of the symbolic system Jimmy had been developing. The page was titled "Messages for the Living." Jimmy believed that the hardest part of being a warrior wasn't the fighting, Mrs. Rodriguez said. It was coming home and learning how to live with peace. He was studying ways to help his soldiers make that transition successfully. Marcus felt emotions welling up that he'd been suppressing for years. The idea that Jimmy had been thinking about Marcus's future, about his ability to find meaning and purpose after the war, was almost overwhelming. "What does it say?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What was he trying to tell me?" Mrs. Rodriguez smiled, the first truly joyful expression Marcus had seen from her since arriving. "He was telling you how to find your way home, Marcus. Not just geographically, but spiritually. He was giving you a map for rebuilding your life." She began explaining the meaning of each symbol in the tattoo, connecting them to concepts from Jimmy's notes and traditional Navajo teachings. What emerged was not just a message, but a comprehensive guide for healing from trauma, rebuilding relationships, finding purpose, and contributing to community. The curved lines represented the circular nature of life and healing. The geometric shapes symbolized different aspects of human experience that needed to be balanced. The connecting marks showed how all these elements work together to create wholeness and meaning. But most importantly, the entire design contained specific instructions for steps Marcus could take to move beyond survival mode and begin truly living again. As Mrs. Rodriguez explained each element, Marcus felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. For 12 years, he'd been carrying around not just a memorial to his fallen squad leader, but a roadmap for personal transformation that he'd never understood. Jimmy Rodriguez hadn't just died trying to save his men from an explosion. He died trying to give them tools for saving themselves from the long-term effects of trauma and isolation. "He knew you'd figure it out eventually," Mrs. Rodriguez said as she finished her explanation. "He had faith that when you were ready to understand, you'd find a way to learn what the symbols meant." Marcus looked down at his forearm with new eyes. What had been a source of shame and mockery for 15 years was actually one of the most precious gifts he'd ever received. Jimmy had literally died trying to give him a message of hope and healing. But understanding the message was only the beginning. Now Marcus had to decide what to do with the knowledge he'd gained. As evening approached, Mrs. Rodriguez invited Marcus to stay for dinner and to spend the night in Jimmy's old room. She wanted to hear more stories about her son, and Marcus found himself sharing memories he'd never told anyone else. They talked late into the night about Jimmy's leadership style, his sense of humor, his dedication to his men, and his deep love for his family. Mrs. Rodriguez shared stories from Jimmy's childhood and his early military career, painting a picture of a young man who had always felt called to protect and serve others. "He used to say that being a soldier wasn't just a job," Mrs. Rodriguez said as they sat on the front porch looking up at the star-filled sky. "He said it was a responsibility to be a bridge between the civilian world and the warrior world to help both sides understand each other." Marcus thought about his own struggles with civilian life, his difficulty connecting with people who hadn't shared his experiences, his sense of isolation and disconnection. Maybe Jimmy's message wasn't just about personal healing. Maybe it was also about finding ways to serve as that bridge. "Mrs. Rodriguez, do you think Jimmy would want me to share this information with other veterans? Help them understand what the symbols mean?" She was quiet for a long time, apparently considering the question carefully. "I think Jimmy would want you to use this knowledge however you felt called to use it," she said finally. "But I also think he'd want you to heal yourself first. You can't help others find their way if you're still lost yourself." That night, sleeping in Jimmy's childhood bedroom, surrounded by photographs and mementos from his life, Marcus had the most peaceful sleep he'd experienced in years. For the first time since returning from Afghanistan, he didn't have nightmares. Instead, he dreamed about possibilities, about healing, about purpose, about using Jimmy's gift to help other veterans find their way home. When he woke up the next morning, Marcus felt different. Not completely healed, he understood that would take time and work, but hopeful. For the first time in years, he could envision a future that involved more than just surviving from one day to the next. Mrs. Rodriguez made breakfast and sent Marcus on his way with a folder containing copies of Jimmy's journal pages and additional information about the symbolic system he developed. She also gave him her phone number and made him promise to stay in touch. "Jimmy would be proud of you for not giving up," she said as Marcus prepared to leave. He always believed his soldiers would find their way home eventually. As Marcus drove back toward Arizona, his mind raced with plans and possibilities. He thought about Robert Chun, the Navy commander he'd met just a few days ago, and wondered if Jimmy's message might help Robert in his own healing process. He thought about other veterans he'd known over the years who were struggling with their transition to civilian life. Most importantly, he thought about himself and the work he needed to do to implement Jimmy's guidance in his own life. Understanding the symbols was just the first step. The real work would involve taking concrete actions to rebuild his relationships, find meaningful purpose, and contribute to his community. For the first time in 15 years, Marcus felt like he had a plan that went beyond simple survival. He had a roadmap for transformation, created by someone who had loved him enough to die trying to deliver it. The tattoo on his arm would never again be a source of shame or embarrassment. From now on, it would be a reminder of hope, of possibility, and of the enduring power of brotherhood forged in the crucible of shared sacrifice. Marcus drove through the desert with tears streaming down his face, but for the first time in years, they were tears of gratitude rather than grief. Jimmy Rodriguez had given him one final gift, and Marcus was finally ready to receive it. The sun was setting as Marcus reached the Arizona border, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red. He pulled over a rest stop and called Robert Chin's number, knowing that the Navy commander might need to hear about the power of symbols and the importance of messages passed from the living to the living. Sometimes, Marcus thought as he waited for Robert to answer, the most important conversations happen when we least expect them. Sometimes the healing begins with understanding that we're not as alone as we think we are. And sometimes the answers we've been searching for have been with us all along, waiting for us to develop the wisdom and courage to see them clearly. Robert Chun answered his phone on the second ring, his voice carrying the controlled composure of someone who had learned to function despite deep emotional pain. When he heard Marcus's voice, that composure softened considerably. "Marcus, how are you doing? I wasn't expecting to hear from you so soon." "I'm good, actually. Better than I've been in years." Marcus looked out across the desert landscape as the last light faded from the sky. "Robert, remember when you asked if I ever wondered whether any of it was worth it? The service, the sacrifice, the people we lost. Of course, that conversation meant a lot to me. I think I found some answers. Not just for me, but maybe for you too." Marcus took a deep breath. "Are you somewhere you can talk for a while? I've got a story to tell you, and I think it might help." For the next hour, Marcus shared everything that had happened since their chance meeting outside the convenience store. He told Robert about the tattoo, about Jimmy Rodriguez, about the journey to New Mexico, and the discovery of the symbolic system Jimmy had created. He explained how a message that had seemed meaningless for 12 years had suddenly revealed itself to be a comprehensive guide for healing and transformation. Robert listened without interruption, asking only occasional clarifying questions. When Marcus finished his story, the line was quiet for several minutes. "That's incredible," Robert said finally. "Your squad leader created an entire communication system just to help his soldiers transition back to civilian life." "That's exactly what he did. And, Robert, I think there might be something in this for you too. The symbols talk about different types of loss and different pathways for healing. Some of it specifically addresses survivor guilt and the responsibility leaders feel for the people under their command." Marcus could hear Robert's breathing change, becoming deeper and more deliberate. "What does it say about that? About survivor guilt?" Marcus consulted the notes Mrs. Rodriguez had given him, finding the section that dealt with leadership and loss. Jimmy wrote that survivor guilt is actually a form of spiritual injury that occurs when someone mistakes temporary responsibility for eternal ownership. He said that leaders who carry the weight of their people's deaths are trying to control outcomes that were never fully in their control. "Go on," Robert said quietly. He believed that the healing process required leaders to transform their guilt into what he called living honor. Instead of carrying the weight of the dead, we carry their memory forward through our actions. We honor their sacrifice by becoming better versions of ourselves and by helping others do the same. Marcus heard Robert take a shaky breath. "How do we do that? How do we transform guilt into honor?" According to Jimmy's system, it starts with accepting that death is part of the warrior's path, not a failure of leadership. Then, we focus on using our survival as an opportunity to serve something larger than ourselves. We become bridges between the world of the living and the world of the dead, carrying messages and wisdom that can help others. The conversation continued for another hour as Marcus shared more details from Jimmy's symbolic system and his notes about healing from trauma. Robert asked thoughtful questions and shared his own insights about leadership, loss, and the challenge of finding meaning after experiencing profound grief. Marcus, Robert said as their conversation began to wind down, would you be willing to come to San Diego? I'd like to introduce you to some people, other military leaders who are struggling with similar issues. I think what you've discovered could help a lot of people. Marcus felt a familiar flutter of anxiety at the thought of speaking to groups of people, but underneath the anxiety was something new, a sense of purpose that felt bigger than his personal comfort zone. I'd be honored to do that, Marcus said. When were you thinking? How about next weekend? I can arrange accommodations and transportation. There's a monthly gathering of military leaders from all services who meet to discuss post-service transition issues. Your story would be exactly what they need to hear. After ending the call with Robert, Marcus sat in his truck for a long time, watching the stars emerge in the clear desert sky. For 12 years, he'd been carrying around what he thought was a memorial to a fallen friend. Now he understood that it was actually a commission, an assignment from Jimmy Rodriguez to help other veterans find their way home from the wars they'd fought. The drive back to Phoenix gave Marcus time to process everything that had happened over the past few days. His entire understanding of his military service, his loss, and his purpose had been fundamentally transformed. Instead of being a damaged veteran struggling to find meaning in civilian life, he was beginning to see himself as someone entrusted with important knowledge that could help others heal. But Marcus also understood that sharing Jimmy's message would require him to first do his own healing work. Mrs. Rodriguez had been right when she said that he needed to heal himself before he could help others find their way. Over the next week, Marcus began implementing the guidance contained in Jimmy's symbolic system. The process was more challenging than he'd expected, requiring him to confront emotions and memories he'd been avoiding for years. The first step involved what Jimmy called acknowledging the circle. This meant accepting that his experience of war, loss, and struggle was part of a larger cycle that included not just trauma, but also growth, healing, and service to others. Instead of seeing his suffering as meaningless, he began to understand it as preparation for helping others navigate similar challenges. The second step was rebuilding the connections. Jimmy's system emphasized that isolation was both a symptom of trauma and a barrier to healing. Marcus needed to begin reaching out to other people, not just to receive support, but to offer it as well. Marcus started by contacting David Chun, the veteran who had provided information about Jimmy's background. Their phone conversations evolved into regular check-ins, and Marcus discovered that David was struggling with his own post-service transition issues. By sharing Jimmy's symbolic system, Marcus was able to help David begin his own healing process. Marcus also reached out to other veterans he'd encountered over the years, people from the VFW Hall, former co-workers from various jobs, even some of the guys from his current construction crew. He was surprised to discover how many people were dealing with issues similar to his own, and how grateful they were to have someone who understood their experiences. The third step in Jimmy's system was finding the path of service. This involved identifying ways to use his survival and his hard-won wisdom to benefit others. For Marcus, this meant beginning to think seriously about Robert Chen's invitation to speak to military leaders in San Diego. But it also meant smaller acts of service closer to home. Marcus began volunteering at the local VA hospital, helping other veterans navigate the bureaucracy and find resources they needed. He started attending veteran support groups, not just as someone seeking help, but as someone who could offer insight and encouragement to others. Most surprisingly, Marcus began having conversations with his co-workers at the construction site about his military service and the meaning of his tattoo. Instead of hiding it or feeling ashamed of it, he started sharing the story of Jimmy Rodriguez and the message of hope and healing that the symbols represented. The response from his co-workers was completely different than what Marcus had expected. Instead of mockery or dismissal, he encountered curiosity, respect, and even gratitude. Several of his coworkers had family members who had served in various branches of the military, and they were hungry for insight into the challenges veterans faced during their transition to civilian life. Even Bill Morrison, his boss, seemed to see Marcus differently after learning the true story behind his tattoo. The conversation happened during their weekly check-in meeting, when Morrison noticed that Marcus seemed more engaged and energetic than he'd been in years. "You're different lately, Thompson," Morrison said. "More focused, more confident. What's changed?" Marcus had decided to be completely honest about his journey, so he told Morrison everything. The search for the tattoo's meaning, the trip to New Mexico, the discovery of Jimmy's symbolic system, and his growing sense of purpose. Morrison listened with the same attention he gave to important construction blueprints, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly just absorbing the story. "So this tattoo that I thought was unprofessional," Morrison said when Marcus finished, "it's actually a guide for helping veterans transition successfully to civilian life." "That's exactly what it is. My squad leader died, trying to give me tools for healing and transformation. I just didn't understand what I was carrying around for 12 years. Morrison was quiet for several minutes, apparently processing the implications of what he'd heard. "Marcus, how would you feel about sharing this story with the consultants from the VA hospital project? I think they might find it very interesting." Marcus felt a flutter of the old anxiety, but it was overshadowed by the sense of purpose he'd been cultivating. "I'd be willing to do that if you think it would be helpful. I think it would be more than helpful. I think it might change how they approach the entire project." The meeting with the VA hospital consultants took place the following week in the construction company's main conference room. Marcus had prepared by reviewing Jimmy's notes and practicing his presentation with Robertson over the phone, but he was still nervous as he faced a room full of military officers, medical professionals, and project managers. But as Marcus began telling his story, his nervousness faded. The room was completely silent, with everyone focused intently on his words. When he showed them his tattoo and explained the meaning of the symbols, several people leaned forward to get a better look. Commander Sarah Williams, the lead military consultant on the project, asked the first question. "Mr. Thompson, how many other veterans do you think might benefit from understanding this symbolic system?" "Potentially thousands," Marcus replied. "Every veteran who's struggling with the transition to civilian life could use tools for healing and finding purpose. The specific symbols might be unique to my squad leader's creation, but the underlying principles apply to everyone who's experienced trauma and loss." Dr. Patricia Gonzalez, a psychiatrist specializing in PTSD treatment, asked the next question. "Have you considered developing this into a formal treatment program? Something that could be implemented in VA hospitals and veteran service centers?" Marcus had thought about that possibility, but he didn't feel qualified to develop formal treatment protocols. "I'm not a medical professional or a trained therapist," he said, "but I'd be very interested in working with people who are to see if Jimmy's insights could be adapted for broader use." What followed was a 2-hour brainstorming session about how Jimmy's symbolic system could be integrated into veteran services. The consultants were particularly interested in the emphasis on service and community connection as healing mechanisms, which aligned with emerging research about post-traumatic growth. By the end of the meeting, Marcus had agreed to participate in a pilot program that would test the effectiveness of Jimmy's principles with a small group of veterans at the new VA hospital. He would work with professional therapists and researchers to develop curriculum and training materials. More importantly, the consultants had decided to incorporate space for innovative treatment programs into the hospital's design, specifically to accommodate approaches like the one Marcus had described. As Marcus left the meeting, he felt a profound sense of completion. Jimmy Rodriguez's final message hadn't just provided personal healing. It was beginning to create opportunities for healing on a much larger scale. That evening, Marcus called Robertson to share the news about the VA hospital project. Robert was thrilled, both for Marcus personally and for the potential impact on other veterans. "This is exactly what Peterson would have wanted," Robert said, referring to the sailor he'd lost in Afghanistan. "Using our experiences to help others, making sure that sacrifices lead to something positive rather than just more pain." Robert also had news for Marcus. The gathering of military leaders in San Diego had been moved up to the following weekend, and he'd arranged for Marcus to be the keynote speaker. Instead of just sharing his story informally, Marcus would be presenting to nearly 200 military officers from all service branches. The prospect was simultaneously exciting and terrifying. Marcus had never spoken to such a large group, and certainly not to an audience of senior military leaders. But he also understood that this was exactly the kind of service Jimmy's system called for, using his experience and wisdom to help others find their way. Marcus spent the following week preparing for his presentation, working with both Robert Shun and Mrs. Rodriguez to ensure that he accurately represented Jimmy's symbolic system and its cultural foundations. Mrs. Rodriguez was particularly helpful in explaining the Navajo traditions that had influenced Jimmy's work, adding depth and context to the message Marcus would deliver. She also provided additional materials from Jimmy's journal, including sections that dealt specifically with military leadership and the responsibility leaders felt for the welfare of their personnel. This material would be particularly relevant to Marcus's audience in San Diego. "My son would be so proud," Mrs. Rodriguez said during one of their phone conversations. "He always believed his soldiers would carry his teachings forward, but I don't think even he imagined it would reach this many people." Marcus felt the weight of that responsibility, but it was a good weight, the kind of purpose that gave meaning to struggle and transformed suffering into service. The night before leaving for San Diego, Marcus stood in his bathroom looking at his tattoo in the mirror. For 15 years, it had been a source of shame and isolation. For the past few weeks, it had been a symbol of hope and transformation. Now, it was becoming something even larger, a tool for healing that could potentially help thousands of veterans find their way home from the wars they've fought. Marcus thought about Jimmy Rodriguez, bleeding to death on a mountainside in Afghanistan, but still concerned about the welfare of the soldiers who would survive him. Jimmy had given his life not just to save his squad from an explosion, but to ensure they had the tools they needed to build meaningful lives after the war ended. That kind of love, Marcus realized, deserved to be shared as widely as possible. Jimmy's final message wasn't meant to stay hidden under Marcus's sleeve for 12 years. It was meant to be proclaimed from rooftops, shared in conference rooms, and implemented in treatment programs. As Marcus packed for his trip to San Diego, he felt like he was finally becoming the person Jimmy Rodriguez had believed he could be. Not just a survivor of war, but a bridge between worlds, someone who could help other veterans understand that their struggles had meaning and their survival had purpose. The tattoo on his arm had stopped being just a memorial. It had become a commission, a calling, and a gift that kept giving the more it was shared. Marcus had spent 12 years asking, "What the hell's that tattoo?" Now he knew the answer, and he was ready to share it with anyone who.